Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies, and in this episode, we're going to talk about how to make hills, modular ones, and also how to make hills that are unusual shapes. A couple of weeks ago, I was contacted through my Etsy store by a client looking for a custom hill for a diorama she was working on. She needed a triangular hill to go in the corner of a miniature spread that she was building. I'm taking terrain commissions right now, so I got down to work on the project. Often I don't feature my commission jobs on the channel, but being a different subject from my normal builds, I got the client's permission to feature it, and I got to work on a video. I also took the opportunity to make a couple of pieces using the same process to add some large modular hills to my Etsy store. Because the majority of my viewers are wargamers or diorama builders, hills are particularly important as they're the most basic and universally used piece of terrain. They're also the best seller in my store. Despite this, the majority of the hills you see out there are just made as plain green lumps. I've explained this before, but my philosophy is that every piece of terrain I make is a unique piece of art, no matter what its use. They all need to have character and plenty of visual interest. My thought is that your terrain should be as much of a centerpiece for your spread or games table as any character model that you might have. So sit back and watch the process as I build some custom-shaped modular hills. Whether you're building a whole table for a store or a club, or just one simple one-off piece of terrain, you always need a plan. I knew what the measurements would be from the client, so this was pretty straightforward. However, right from the start, I knew it was going to require a lot of styrofoam and it was going to have a lot of leftovers. This meant that I could use the leftovers just simply to build more hills. I went ahead, got out my ruler, and measured out the triangular shape on a single piece of half-inch insulation foam. From there, I went ahead and measured out the triangular shape over and over again until I had enough to make the hill as high as the client wanted. Using hot glue, I then glued all the layers on top of each other until I sort of had a foam sandwich. Using my hot foam cutting table, I then went ahead and cut each of the edges so that they were all even. I then measured an angle into the side so that I could build the slant into the hill. With my hot foam cutter table, I place it next to the filament and cut the whole thing out. This created different halves. One I was going to use for the hill, the other I was going to use as the leftovers for making other pieces of terrain. I arranged the leftover pieces so that the pre-cut edges could go back to back. Then, getting up my hot foam cutter, I cut downwards from the top through all the layers at a gentle angle. I made sort of a ragged shape so that I would get a hill. Because the pre-cut edges were back to back, that meant each piece of hill could be divided into two. Now I had the foam blanks cut out for the triangular hill and the modular hill, but I needed to do something about how harsh the edges were. They were pretty steep. So I went ahead, got out some sandpaper, and sanded the edges down so that they were rounded off and more gradual. With that done, it was now time to think about basing the hills. I went and looked for some decent cardboard. I wanted to find something that had more than one ply in it so that it would give the base a lot of strength. This is a pretty good example here from a Lego box that one of my sons got his Christmas present in. I put each foam blank on top of a sheet of the cardboard, and then with a pen scribed out an edge that was a little wider than the blank itself. Then with a sharp knife, I cut the base out. In all, I actually cut 2 bases for each piece. The second base was cut just a little bit wider again than the first one, and I made sure that the grain of the cardboard in that one ran at a right angle to the one above it. This would make sure that everything was very strong and firm when it was all finished. Now I used hot glue to glue the bottom layer to the top layer, and then I glued the foam hills themselves right on top of the top layer. With this complete, it was now time to start putting the specific details into the hills themselves. Using a knife, I cut a rock pattern into the hill by taking little cracks and crevices out of it, and I also went and got a pile of cut-offs of foam that I could sculpt into rocks. I worked away at each one until I had a very large variety of different sized pieces of foam that made convincing rocks. I also got some pieces of matchstick and bamboo skewer that I had snapped off into smaller chunks to imply deadfall and scattered wood. With hot glue, I then went in and glued these down in random spots all over each of the hills. Because the edges were kind of ragged, or in some spots still kind of steep, I took out some masking tape, always use a good quality brand, and I went back over the edges. I put the tape over top, and in some spots used the tape to build a bit of an angle between the steep portions of where the hill joined the base. Now I turned my attention to putting grit on the hills. I started by taking some Mod Podge and mixed it with some black acrylic paint. If you don't have Mod Podge though, you could just use white glue. Then I spread it down over the surface of the hills, including at least partially on some of the rocks, and then I began sprinkling this with sand and kitty litter. I usually use a mix of about 80% sand to about 20% kitty litter. When I had this applied to all of the hills, I then went ahead to continue to seal it down. I took out some rubbing alcohol, mixed it with a little black ink, and applied that over top of all the sand and glue, making sure that the glue below it was still wet. Once the rubbing alcohol was applied, I then got out more Mod Podge, this time mixed with even more water to make it so that it flowed very evenly, and then laid this down over top of the other layers. I left this to dry overnight, and in the morning, when everything had dried, it'll have pre-primed the model, and everything will be rock solid. I was able to now start painting. I pretty much always use the same process on my scenery because I want it to match with my table, and because that's what I'm comfortable with. So I started with a dry brush of dark brown. Don't use your good model paints on this, just use something from the dollar store. After I put the dark brown down, I moved to a tan. When the dry brush of tan was on, then I got out some dark gray, and in a more targeted way, dry brushed that over the larger rocks. I then put over top of that some lighter gray. Going back to the whole base again, I used a little off-white and dry brushed it over the whole thing, but I did it fairly sparingly because I didn't want it to look like it was wintertime. Finally, when that was done, I got out some pure white and went back and applied that over the rocks specifically. I was pretty careful with this, using a small brush, only aiming for the largest, most exposed portions of the rock. With this finished, now I could take out some black acrylic ink, put it on a fine brush, and go back and line in some of the major details. That would be the cracks in the rock, around some of the debris and larger stones that were sitting on the surface, and anything that I wanted to stand out. This might seem kind of tedious to you, but trust me, it's important. It lets you single out specific features that you want to be a focus of the attention for your viewers. Now I could begin the landscaping, and as always, I started with static grass, getting out some fresh Mod Podge and making sure there's no paint in it. I went ahead and spread it thickly over the side of each hill in patches. I don't like to make my bases entirely green. I think that's kind of boring, so I do grassy patches. After putting it down, I then mix up a few different colors of static grass and go ahead and sprinkle them on. I vary it from base to base and spot to spot to make sure that not all of the patches of color are even or uniform. I could now add grass tufts and other vegetation effects, such as lichens. I always like to get out a big variety, as it really pays off to have quite a different selection on the base. It just adds color and interest. Taking out clumps of various tufts, I dip them in Mod Podge and place them more or less randomly around each hill. I can also use these to conceal small errors or gaps that may have got past me in the earlier processes. Once I'm happy with the quantity that's on each base, then I go ahead and just take the whole hill and give it a couple coats of matte varnish. This helps seal down the grass and the vegetation effects and protect it from the wear and tear of regular daily wargaming or being handled as part of a display. And with that, the project was done. Now I had a custom hill made to the exact dimensions laid out by the client that will soon be speeding on its way by Canada Post to their diorama spread. I also now had a couple large hills that separated in the middle that I could use on my own games table, and they'll be showing up in the Etsy store. All in all, with a nice cross-section of small details, rock effects, and vegetation, these hills generate a lot of visual interest and are better than just plain green lumps. Now all I need to do is get to some wargaming. That's it for this episode. I hope you liked watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Please remember that Miniature Landscape Hobbies is supported entirely by its viewers. If you would like to assist with the production, please consider joining me on Patreon. I have many levels for my Patreons to subscribe to. You can get access to the STL files I use, and even receive painting lessons or terrain. If Patreon's not your thing, then how about you head over to my Etsy store. There you'll see many of the projects, including the hills I built in this video, for sale. Any purchases you might make help support the channel. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Remember to subscribe, and as always, remember to keep building life in miniature.